This is the third of 3 videos on democracy in a globalized world. This video will go over the concept of cosmopolitan democracy. Now, Held theorizes that this model of cosmopolitan democracy in order to take into account the effects of globalization. Globalization now means that we are all citizens of a number of overlapping communities. We're members of nations, regions, global networks, and so on, all of which are affected by forces, problems, and organizations which transcend national boundaries. They cross over national boundaries. So if we want to have better democratic control of issues that are beyond the scope of the nation state, Held says we must restructure, quote, the territorial boundaries of systems of accountability. So we have to rethink the role of regional and global regulatory agencies. We need to reform some of these organizations, such as the UN, while also creating new ones that can create a layer of democratic government that's able to override state sovereignty within clearly defined spheres of activity. So it's not just willy-nilly. You have to have it defined. And for issues and activities that have clear transnational and international consequences. So the many institutional consequences are clearly set out in this model. So we can start with this principle of justification. Quote, in a world of intensifying regional and global relations with marked overlapping communities of fate, the principle of autonomy requires entrenchment in regional and global networks, as well as in national and local polities. Now, the term communities of fate refers to the idea that when you're born, you don't choose what nation you're born into, or your family, or whatever, the neighborhood you live. It is just by chance that you are born and part of that nation or family or community. So Held is saying that in an increasingly globalized world, our communities of fate have moved beyond simply the nation into which we are born. We could call them communities of chance instead of communities of fate. The idea is about the same. As a result, though, he says, we need to pay attention to making sure that we create a form of democracy that takes into account all of these communities and networks between them to ensure that our rights are protected. Now, the key features of this model are divided between short-term and long-term features, as well as between features related to polity and governance, which is on this slide, and then economy and civil society, which is on the next slide. The short and long-term features tend to go hand in hand. So the first one is reform of leading UN governing institutions, such as the Security Council, have to allow for developing countries to have a significant voice and effective decision-making capacity. And we need to create a new charter of rights in the long term, a new charter of rights and obligations for each of the different domains of political, social, and economic power. So these two things go hand in hand, and this is to make things fairer for those countries with the least economic power and to help ensure that multinational corporations are not controlling things or that one country doesn't overpower other smaller countries and so on. We need to have a reform of those main United Nations governing institutions. The second one is this idea that we need to create a second chamber of the United Nations using an international constitutional convention. And so that's in the short term. And in the long term, we need to have a global parliament with some form of revenue raising capacity. So they need to be funded. It needs to be connected to regions and nations and localities, right? So we need to have both. We need to have a second chamber that has a constitutional convention, and we need to have a proper parliament in the long term. The third one is that we need to have enhanced political regionalization, so things like the EU and beyond. And we need to have the use of transnational referenda, so a way of listening to the people. And in the long term, we need to have clear separation of political and economic interests. We need to have public funding of deliberative assemblies and electoral processes to ensure our democratic rights. Fourth is about the creation of a new international human rights course, compulsory jurisdiction before the International Criminal Court. So we need to have, this is the course of power. This is some way of enforcing that countries, nations follow these international rules. And we need in the long term, an interconnected global legal system embracing elements of criminal and civil law. Fifth, we need the establishment, in the short term, the establishment of an effective, accountable international military force. And in the long term, we need a permanent shift of the growing proportion of a nation state's coercive capability to regional and global institutions. So in the long term, we need to move towards an international type of military force to make sure that all nations are doing what they're supposed to do. The features for creating an effective economy and civil society are things that will need to be embedded within constitutions at the national level because they do assume an entrenchment of rights and obligations. So the first one is the enhancement of non-state, non-market solutions in the organization of civil society. So in the short term, we need to make sure that civil society is organized in ways that are more community-oriented rather than state-based or market-based. And in the long term, we need a creation of a diversity of self-regulating associations and groups in civil society. So if we're going to have a different organization, we're going to need to have different types of associations and groups to help not regulate them, but to help make these new ways of doing things work well. We need to, in the short term, we need to be able to experiment with different types of democratic organizational forms in the economy. And in the long term, we need to develop multi-sectoral economies and pluralization of patterns of ownerships and possessions. So we need to be willing to try new things in both these cases. In both the short term and in the long term, we need to not be afraid to try new things. And third, we need to have the provision of resources to those in the most vulnerable social positions to make sure that we can defend their interests and they can articulate their own interests so that they can be their own advocates. This is something that we're going to see why this is so important with the fallout from the current pandemic. So that's in the short term. We need to make sure that we have resources for those who are the most vulnerable. And in the long term, we need to have a public framework investment priorities that are set out through general deliberation and government decision. But at the same time, we need to have clear regulation of the markets for goods and labor. So it's not just a traditional free market economy. We need to have some regulation to make sure that priorities meet the needs of societies rather than the needs of the multinational corporations. In the end, Held is arguing that we need to take into account that globalization is ongoing and that it is a dialectical process. So it's not linear. For example, as globalization changes something at the local level, that change at the local level may affect a change at the regional level, which then may affect a change back at the local level or at the national level, and so on. These changes may happen, they influence each other at all the different levels. So if you visualize it, a dialectical process might look like a spiral. So things are interconnected and they constantly are changing. So we have here the general conditions on this slide. The first general condition that Held identifies for this model of democracy is that we need to have continuing development of regional, international, and global flows of resources and networks of interaction, which will recreate an ongoing cycle of changes, that dialectical process. Secondly, we need to have the recognition by growing numbers of people of the increasing interconnectedness of political communities in diverse domains, including the social, cultural, economic, and environmental. So, in other words, we can't fall back on nationalism in a globalizing world. We have to be thinking broader, in Held's opinion. He says that we also need to have the development of an understanding of overlapping collective fortunes, which requires democratic deliberation at the local, national, regional, and global levels. So this is the idea that we really need to work together for all of us to prosper. We can't continue to have some people profiting from the natural resources of other people without compensating them, for example, or without getting consent. So think of the indigenous groups facing the decimation of their cultures and environment. Fourth, we need to have the enhanced entrenchment of democratic rights and obligations in the making and enforcement of national, regional, and international law. So laws need to be embedded in parliamentary constitutions, for example. Finally, we need to have the transfer of increasing proportions of a nation's military coercive capability to transnational agencies and institutions with the ultimate aim of demilitarization and the transcendence of states' war systems. So it's hard to enforce laws without some form of coercive power, but we want to move away from using force. Instead, we want to build a stronger society that's built on mutual respect and cooperation. And if we want to do that, we have to work together to make sure that all nations are able to do so. So if you compare the two models, democratic autonomy and cosmopolitan democracy, you might notice Held's emphasis on first framing a set of governing institutions capable of regulating the forces which actually shape everyday life. And as these forces become internationalized, so must our democratic institutions and processes evolve to offer citizens some hope of making these forces accountable in this globalized and internationalized world. Second, he also emphasizes the requirements that civil, political, social, and economic rights should be constitutionally entrenched in such a way that they can be legally enforced against states or international powers if necessary. Third, he notes the importance of the need to exert some democratic controls on the current unaccountable exercise of large private concentrations of economic power, so in the shape of corporations at the national level and multinational capital at the global level. So we can't just let multinational corporations do whatever they want. We need to have some way of ensuring that they're doing things in the best interests of the people. Finally, Held highlights the need for attempts to think creatively about the crucial links between economics, politics, and democracy. So he believes we need to encourage experimentation with different democratic organizational forms in the economy through the enhancement of non-state, non-market solutions. So these two models form the answer to Held's question, what should democracy mean today? But remember, his ideas are just one position in really vigorous ongoing debate. Held ends his discussion with a question, is democracy a utopian project? Political power has been reshaped and reconfigured over the last couple centuries at least, and with it, so too has our understanding of democracy. Globalization has changed the way in which we see the world, bringing us in closer communication, but also forcing us to find ways to navigate between differing values and cultures. There's many reasons for pessimism, but there are also reasons for hope in finding a new global order. At the time that Held was writing, 9/11 was at the top of his mind and seemed to be a big barrier to the possibility of creating a form of cosmopolitan democracy. The concerns about American unilateralism and the ongoing cycle of violence in the Middle East continue today, but we can wonder how the current global pandemic may reshape our interactions at the global level. And I leave you with this final question. Where do you stand on democracy today? And this ends the third video for this week's